Happy Friday. Hopefully I'm not freezing or anything else weird happening. Let me know if there's any audio video visual difficulties. They've been bedeviling me this week, and I don't really know how to test for them. So I'm just bearing with it for the moment. Hopefully we'll be good. So far audio's been good. It's just been visual, so fingers crossed the visuals stay visual. This is what is this? Watered down apple cider for the working man. We're back at Muster. We're at the campaign setup portion of the program, so let's just start there. Campaign setup. I encourage practitioners to treat the campaign, bolded, as the basic unit of game development for D&D. The commercial history of the game has distorted this reality, encouraging us to think in terms of which game brand it is you're working with. We are playing Advanced Dungeons & Dragons should be a trivial gesture toward the kind of rules tech you use, not the foundation of the practice. The true foundation is that we are playing D&D, a war game concerned with adventurous small unit commando fantasy warfare stuff, and other adventure fiction matters from pirates to spaceships. The game has certain fundamental technical conceits, ranging from a combined referee GM to party-based play to the use of hit points, but that's all it is. Elevating the petty technicalities of addition over this foundation is missing the forest for the trees. What may be worse, caring so very much about the game text blinds you to the house you should be building, your own campaign. For gamers used to thinking in RPG culture ways, I would encourage you to think of your own campaign as the game. Specifically, your campaign is the platform into which matters like the game setting and the game rules hang on to. You don't first choose to play AD&D, then choose to play Forgotten Realms, and then start a campaign. It's actually the other way around. First decide to start a D&D campaign, titillated by various creative ideas, and you prepare to fulfill those ideas by putting together rules, settings, lore, players, and other things. Give the campaign a name. I found that this helps in treating it as the creative project it is. But perhaps that comes after being at it for a while. Belay that. Don't name your first campaign the moment you begin. See if it lights a blaze first, then name it for the most memorable thing from the early sessions, or set it aside and start again. Not every practice work deserves a name. The important part is understanding your relationship to the game as that of an artisan or explorer working alongside the rest of us, not according to a set game text that determines what tribe you belong in, but by shared ethos that determines what you work towards. With that part clear, I'll share some basic ideas about how to kick a campaign into action. Just some practical suggestions. You'll find similar advice in the best game texts. Yeah, I don't think there's anything I disagree with. I don't know that everyone starts from the campaign outwards. I think some folks want to play D&D. Some folks may want to play in Forgotten Realms. I don't know. I think as you go along, you probably end up at that spot where you're starting with from the campaign first. And I think that's probably the best way to I would say that's maybe the way I would say I would want to start things from, and where I would tend to start things myself. But I do think there's a little bit of what you develop into versus where you may start. Obviously, Muster as a tome is not one that, at least this section of it, that I would say, oh, yes, if you're brand new, maybe you should get into. I don't know. You folks can tell me if you feel like if you had a friend that was thinking they wanted to get into the OSR, would you just hand them Muster? I definitely would want them to read, I think, the first portions of it. I don't know if we're into more, I don't know, advanced philosophy, Muster 201 versus Muster 101. Well, let's see where we go from here. Don't be afraid to set up a basic campaign. I found that the forward leaning is real with excited new referees, which tend to mean that the game is being learned in an unnecessarily complicated way, hurrying too far too fast. This tendency goes for role-playing in general, but in D&D specifically, it means a tendency to skip the clean basic game in favor of emulating ideas and practices of extended open-world games, faking it when you can't do it for real. Remember the basic D&D I described before, the linear game that begins at the dungeon entrance. The referee prepares a single dungeon with simple atomic interactions. Monsters in this room, a trap in this one, a random encounter table for the occasional corridor encounter, no complex multi-room interactions. Those can emerge and play. Simple goals, mostly treasure hunting. I do think this is true. I think that I've often seen GMs just want to go to 1,000 before they've gotten to 10 yet, and try to incorporate a whole bunch of stuff, try to make a huge thing, all this stuff from jump. And all of that just becomes, I don't know, almost a self-fulfilling prophecy of doom kind of thing. It's really hard to pull off. It's a lot of work. If any of those things fall down, if your players aren't up to that task, if you're not really up to that task, all this stuff happens. The whole thing just tends to kind of collapse. And it can be a case where someone doesn't want to pick up the game again. It can really drive someone off the game or drive them from GMing, when the reality is that it's great that you have such enthusiasm and you want to take it and run with it, but maybe walk first, the go into the wading pool before diving headlong into the deep end kind of thing. Dungeon Master Masterclass says, if they haven't played anything before, I wouldn't want them to read anything. Why ruin the blank slate? Well, I think it depends. I agree with you in terms of, so I guess it depends what we mean by if they're new from nothing. If they just have no idea, like my daughter, right? So I this is a while back. We played a session of kind of a D&D-ish game. Of course, I wasn't going to have her read a book on play. She doesn't know anything. She's literally a blank slate. There are other folks that come in the hobby that may have come in through media, through Stranger Things, through Critical Role, through some other things. So even though they haven't played before, the slate isn't clean. And there can be that bit where you might need to help them wipe the slate clean or reset their slate or reset their expectations. I think that's been one of the challenges in kind of a post, I don't want to say just Critical Role, but post more cultural availability of D&D in various fictions, is that someone can have no idea how to play the game, but still have expectations of what the game is because they've seen it in some media. Maybe they watched the D&D movie, Honor Among Thieves. Maybe they saw this other thing. So yeah, they haven't played, but they're not expectation free, I guess. And certainly if they're coming from something else or they do have a lot of expectations, I think something you can help set them, which may do a better job than you can explain it, which I think is some of the value of having kind of a book or a piece of a book, something you can hand to somebody, is much like when you see a video for how to play a board game versus reading the board game rules. Sometimes the person explaining, like I think Mustard does a decent job of this, and some of the other OSR docs do too, of setting it up in a way that's easier than just trying to do it yourself or trying to say, here, read the first bit of the basic book. But it's all different approaches. But yes, I would think for somebody who has literally just like, hey, we're just going to kind of play this game and we have no idea, don't need to necessarily set groundwork. But oftentimes, especially now, people have expectations and have ideas, even if they've never played anything before. That's a great game, though I completely understand if it isn't obvious to somebody who comes into role-playing from a place of fantastic imagination and adventure. The dungeon thing seems so very drab. But here's something you won't see unless you try it. That game is brutal. It's a game of death and despair and of pushing your luck with extreme stakes. I'm not in the grips of nostalgia or irony when I say that it's fair fun to set up an adventurer party and send them into some hellhole to kick down a dungeon door, only to then try to be the first player to declare, scream, my retreat from the ghouls. Yes, that happens often enough. The basic game will swiftly teach absolute fundamentals, the importance of hit points, what experience points mean, and the way the game doesn't care about your feelings, only about your decisions. It will be very useful for success in more advanced D&D to first master the basic dungeon game. This is also why I like starting at first level, and I know that even Gygax started third level and things like that. And I think if I was playing with a bunch of people and we've been playing for a while, I could see doing that. But I think especially for kind of newer folks who aren't experienced players, I think starting at first level helps lay that foundation. And I know one time I did that video where I wondered if some of the issues with folks with 5th edition wasn't because they all started at third level, which, especially in 5e, sort of changes the whole scope of the game because you unlock your subclasses. And yeah, it gives you a lot more toys to work with, but it gives you a lot more toys to work with. And sometimes I think, kind of like in school where your teacher won't let you use the calculator until you've proven you could do it, and then they give you the tool. I also feel like a little bit with these games is, yeah, let somebody do some stuff where they don't have all the fun toys and tools and then give them the tools. That might be just me. You don't need to do much legwork in setting up a basic game. Just get a low-level dungeon, some basic rules set, and start playing. Fix things as you go. There's no reason why the basic campaign cannot grow with time into an extended game if that's what you want to do. Just keep saying yes to those opportunities to follow the diegetic logic of the game events into places as yet unexplored. Own your campaign premise. What you really need to start a campaign is an understanding of what kinds of things you want the campaign to be about in terms of its wargaming exploration. Do you want to have daring sword fights, space exploration, wise wizards risking all to break laws of nature, Get a sense of that and build the campaign, parenthetically, setting situation rules around it. I would advise not to try to be too all-embracing about it. The gaming community has historically encouraged you to think of your campaign in terms of trying to fit everything and the kitchen sink from the official rulebooks into the campaign. All these character classes, all these magic systems, and all these monsters and magic items need to have a home. Ignoring that and focusing on what it is that you really want to do brings real dividends, though. You can always expand the campaign later. Yeah, I think this is one of the big things. I don't know if I want to say it's a generational thing or an edition thing, but you see a lot of that in 5th edition. Folks who feel that, the GM should have everything available. There should be no option that is listed somewhere in some book that the GM won't take. And GMs who frankly want to take pride of play allow everything. Well, I never found that to be a golden, ooh, you allow everything kind of moment, right? I always prefer something that's focused and can really help. Everything is as much as possible looking to hone in and amplify the stuff that the campaign's about. And if you let everything in, really, I would say impossible to do that. For many, often, the substantial theme of the campaign is simply pulp fantasy adventuring. As I like to say, you're a footloose, cynical bastard with a sword in a primitive, romantic, and cruel world. What do you do? Where do you go? There's adventure around every corner. That's the campaign that has so bewitched generations of gamers. Your campaign doesn't have to be any more specific or unique if that's what you want to do. I imagine everybody wants to do that a fair bit before even considering new vistas. But own that premise, whatever it is your interest driving the game, not just what you read in some book. All right, I think that's pretty good. Now we get a summary genre history, which is an interesting, because it looks like organs. I think is that a heart, a little lung? Is there a spleen in there? But it looks like it's these overlapping shapes. I was going to say circular, but they're not all circular, and a timeline. So I guess we got to read this from the bottom up, because it's kind of like an evolutionary tree sort of setup. So we have from, I guess, time immemorial to about 1800, we have pre-modern European culture. These are the cultural antecedents and myth, epics, romances, fairy tales, etc. Oh, these are all right for genres. And then we get from 1800 to around 1900. We're in the early novel period. We get spiritual literature, comedy of manners, gothic novels, penny dreadfuls, journalism, gothic horror, ghost stories, fairy tales, fantasy, literary fairy tales, adventure stories, and historical romances. And those are all, well, there are a few of them that share a line, but basically go from, so I guess I should have done this. So we have one line that goes from journalism to penny dreadful and then continues on into pulp fiction, which is the next era. We have one line that goes from gothic horror to ghost stories and then to weird tales in pulp fiction. You have literary fairy tales that goes into fairy tale fantasy that then evolves, I guess, into fantasy. And then you have the adventure story as one line and the historical romance as another line that converge into the adventure portion of pulp fiction. Now, pulp fiction has about a 50-year span here from 1900 to 1950, divided into the aforementioned crime, fantasy, weird tale, which is the one that Ghost Story evolves into, which I think I failed to mention. So you have crime, weird tale, fantasy, adventure, Western, superhero, science fiction, horror, and romance. Then from the 50s on up, it's a bunch of blobs with only a few, I guess, through lines. So we have the literary fiction blob from 1900 to, I don't know, a little bit pre-2000, which is a class society artifact, not that relevant here or in general. Okay. But still there, literary fiction, but doesn't really amount to anything. You have nonfiction, which kind of goes off. You have crime, chicklet, thriller, etc., mainstream genres. Then you've got the fantasy genre, which is got a weird shape. And you have the through line through there is swords and sorcery. And then some other things mentioned in that fantasy space is Portal, Urban, Gonzo, and Post-Tolkien as kind of types of fantasy. And then you have the last blob is sci-fi, horror, supers, etc. kind of space. What do they call it? Speculative fiction genres. And then that through line that went from sword and sorcery through fantasy into D&D continues on with Gygaxian and then high TSR. And then you also have dungeon fantasy, Gonzo D&D, pulp style, horror D&D, and all kinds of genres becoming some kind of D&D. And there you go. I don't think there's any. I think that's fine. I don't know how. I mean, it's a nice little chart. I don't know how ultimately useful it is. I'm sure it would provoke as much maybe discussion, disagreement as it would agreement. But sure, fine. If one were curious to kind of plot the evolution of genres for the purposes of muster, I think it works just fine. Start small, grow as you go. Some commonly accepted wisdom in old school D&D is that a great campaign is usually not built top down, but rather as the campaign proceeds. While it's possible for a master of the game to start with massive overarching principles and large-scale world building that zooms down into the practical affairs of adventurers, that's not something you should try to do. The game industry, again, misleads the hobbyist here in a difficult to justify way. Commercial setting packages and campaign frameworks generally suggest the idea that great campaigns have massive overhead. Literally hundreds of pages of campaign world material organically referenced for play. This may be this may be a role-playing game, but it is not this game. If you're starting with a basic campaign, you only need basic rules and a dungeon to get into action. Everything else can be built as you go, session by session, as you go. Add more dungeons. Give the base town some character. In fact, detail some NPCs to interact with. Create an overland map. Set up wilderness adventures and urban adventures. Grow the world. What you would really want to have for this is a few clear arch themes that you hew to as you go. But even that is less important than keeping your prep simple and concrete. And yeah, I mean, I think, and I've talked about kind of bottom up, top down, or I think I call it radial, where you try to just kind of build what's around it. I mean, there are some exceptions depending on your game, depending on their players, depending on their classes. For example, if you get a cleric and the cleric player says, "Ooh, well, like what gods do you have?" You kind of want to have something, or maybe you could just say, "Hey, you tell me. You give me the god that your cleric worships, and we'll go from there." That's totally one way you could do it. Or you might say, "Yeah, I want to have a pantheon." Somebody says, "Well, who is the lord of this place?" You probably might want to know that. It might be something that your players may ask. In the basic campaign, as here in Muster, they probably don't care about that because they're in a dungeon, they're going to be going. And so you only really have to maybe think about that when they return to town. But if you start in a town, which folks like to do also, then it might be a natural question to say, who runs the town? Who do they report to, sort of thing. So having some of the broad ideas is good to have. But again, those don't have to be similar to what they're saying here in Muster. Is even if you need to have some scaffolding just to give folks some specificity, you don't need a lot of details. Oh yeah, the king. Yeah, there's king so and so. Okay, great. We're in this kingdom. All right, awesome. Right. That's it. You don't need to have his whole family line and lineage. The cleric doesn't need to know all the pantheon, just the one that they pick. You could say to them, okay, well, we've basically got Greek god analog. So what's your favorite Greek god that you want? And okay, I want Zeus. Okay, great. Well, his name's not Zeus. His name is something else, but he's essentially Zeus, so fine. Right. So I think while sometimes you may want to have a little bit more around your game to start, always go for the bare minimum that you need. And when players start to ask questions, then you can try to come up. All you got to do is come up with the answer that satisfies that question. Don't need to go any further than that. I think often not going further than that gives you a lot more flexibility. Because oftentimes when a GM will go wild world building before they start, they create corners that they get trapped in. And then they end up in this box. And a lot of it's of a GM's own making, where I've seen GMs who just refuse to break what they've written. I wrote the game like this. Like, okay, but it doesn't work. You're trapped. If you just erase that line, you'd be fine. No, can't do that. Right. So by not doing too much, you allow yourself lots of space for things to evolve in a way that's going to be organic to your campaign, as opposed to trying to pre-think everything out. And then you end up in a spot that doesn't work for you, doesn't work for your players. Dungeon Master Masterclass says, what if you can't stop yourself from making up the past 100 years of the Lord's family? Asking for a friend. Well, here's the thing is you can do that, but just write it in pencil. My rule of thumb is if I haven't mentioned it to the party, then it's just potential. We don't know that it's happening yet. So you can write down that 100 years of history, but just keep it like it's a possibility. If that's how it turns out, then great. You've got your 100 years. If you get to the point and you're like, all of a sudden, you're like, oh no, but this other plot line won't work if this family tree is the way I had it, because he's got to have an uncle that did this instead of that, or marry this person instead of that person, then great. No one ever heard about it yet, so it didn't exist in the game. So change it. But I think the big thing is just, if it hasn't come out in the game, write it in pencil, keep that eraser handy, and erase it. Erase it if you need to. The Hexcrawl campaign seed. For referees wanting to kickstart an extended overland campaign from session 1, here's a simple tried and true structural recipe favored in old school gaming. We're assuming a Hexcrawl technical context here, but you can do a similar setup with other kinds of overland travel and exploration rules too. All right, this should be good. First, take an empty sheet of hex paper and place a normal town typical of the setting in the middle. Give the place a name. This will be the base town that the campaign begins in, so it's populated by some people with adventurous potential. Draw some terrain in the surrounding hexes, just whatever comes to mind. Maybe let's assume that the hexes are each 6 miles wide, unless you have other opinions. Figure out what the town lives on, signify terrain accordingly. Color in all the hexes around the town. Second, choose 3 low-level adventure modules you like. It's good for them to offer variety in terms of size, difficulty, and theming. Adventures that you want to exist in the campaign setting, obviously. Place the chosen adventures in hexes surrounding the base town. 1 to 5 hexes away from town. Whatever placement makes sense for the adventure and the terrain. Draw in the terrain around the adventure locations as well, filling in the hexes they're in and any hexes surrounding them. Third, construct a base lore package for the players about the starting town and its surroundings. Put in some fun literary color like a reference to some regional history or whatnot. Pull on those initial adventure modules. What do they assume about the surrounding world? Write about those initial adventure locations in the lore package. Provide quote-unquote adventure hooks. The goal is not to hide the adventures, but rather to present them to the players in a flavorful way. Tell about reasons to go explore those locations and about obvious kinds of peril that rumors about these locations might warn of. And then fourth, start the game. Get some adventurers together to form a party, and while the players are preparing the party, tell them about the setting. Give them an empty hex sheet to draw their own map as you tell them about the world. Let them make their own notes about the adventuring opportunities, ask questions, and so on. When the players choose which of those adventures to tackle first, you're well on your way. Just keep adding material to the campaign setting, letting things, adventures, wondrous locations, organizations, monsters bounce against each other. That's how I prepped our quote-unquote historical fantasy campaign in 2011. Plopped down the base town and the adventures, Tomb of the Iron God, Tower of the Stargazer, and I think Temple of the Ghoul in the environs. The rest, choosing where to go and what to do, was left to the adventurers. And certainly if you like playing you like running, I should say, pre-made or third-party or whatever adventures, then that's a perfect way to do it. And lots of people do that, right? Oh, I got some spaces here, put them in. You probably want to keep in mind the kind of terrain. So if you're playing, the Lost City or whichever one is in the desert? With the Lost City? Yeah, I think it's the Lost City. Then obviously you need desert. So keep in mind where you're putting them. And then if everything else is in a location, you're like, 1 to 5 hexes away, there's a massive desert. Okay, it may work, it may not work, but you want to kind of just be mindful of that stuff. If you are creating your own campaign, then obviously you may think like, oh gosh, do I need to prep 3 or 4 different adventures? No, right? What you want to do is, and this is where you can use Discord, other tools, is figure out with your players, work with them, maybe on the session 0 and end the session 0 when you've done everything with, okay, you have these 3 locations. Which one do you guys want to go to? Doing a kind of lore package that they talked about. So you might need to know kind of an elevator pitch and a little bit about each one of the places. And then don't start prepping the place until the party says, we are going here. And then you could start prepping there for the next week. And I think it's totally fine to tell your party, hey, I need you to stick with your decision, right? I'm just starting out. I don't have all this material written out. So say you're going there, please don't come next week and say, no, we're actually going to the other place because I'm repping this spot. So I think it's totally fine. Don't feel shy to kind of hold your party to account. If the players say we're going here, especially when you're beginning, say, hey, this is where we're going. Okay, no take backsies. And then, thumbs up, thumbs down, whatever, and then great. And once you've got it, then move ahead. Maintaining a campaign long-term. D&D campaigns are super long compared to many other role-playing games. 100 sessions is not particularly exceptional. In any other game, I consider 20 sessions to be crazy long. I don't actually have any particularly clever observations to make about how to get the game to go long. For us, it just happened when I put the right pieces together. There's this monumental, a nigh incomprehensible challenge of mathematics and war that rises from the simple rules and premise. And it asks you, can you even get to the second level in this thing? If you hear that call and then see those 15 XP you managed in the first session, start thinking about what could have been done better, then that's going to take you far. If not, then perhaps it isn't the game for you. Of course, you want to put the practical things right. Weekly sittings, 4 hours is good. 4 hours. I don't know when the last time I've got to play a 4 hour game, to be honest. But yes, if you could do 4 hours, that is good. On a regular calendar, open and safe social practices, good hospitality, open call for new participants, and constantly rolling teaching practices is not different from any other hobby club. Just this one happens to be practicing the deepest game of all. One difference in the creative dynamics between the wargaming way and other types of adventure gaming I've seen is that the traditional RPG campaign exists sustained by a continuous plot, while the wargame D&D campaign is sustained by that terrible challenge. When we played a 50-session campaign of 4E D&D a couple of years ago, and the plot came to its conclusion, it was a day of satisfaction and joy. It wouldn't have occurred to me to keep going. To the contrary, the last third of the campaign was already a heated race towards the end, pacing the plot of the grand fantasy epic. Challenge-based wargaming campaign doesn't usually have such a plot priority. The campaign, when built into a healthy routine, exists more as a social contract between the club members. It's the stage for play, a platform onto which the group can set various adventurous scenarios. Instead of being like a novel series, the D&D campaign is like a community theater stage, there to be used to stage wargaming. The implication is, of course, that campaigns can be put away and revived. Participants can change, and there's no single character that must live for the campaign to keep going. The campaign lives in the developed rules, setting, and thematic understanding of its subject matter. I think that's all good. I don't think there's anything super controversial there. All right, the next chapter, I guess, scenario formation. A prepared operational campaign is a platform. It consists of a group and a schedule that form a play space. The players set up a setting and characters. This is a D&D campaign. How is it a platform? In the sense that once the campaign is ready, it can be used to present adventures, or to use a more generic wargaming term, scenarios. As long as the campaign persists as a social and creative construct, it is available for the players as a potential platform to launch new challenges. The process by which the campaign moves from being ready to play to entering a specific scenario is of great technical interest, as this is the stage during which much about the ultimate fate of the adventures is being determined. How many adventures are exploring? What are the perils? Arguably, the correlation of forces is what ultimately determines the band of possible outcomes for any adventure before you bring actual player maneuvers into it. You can only do so much with the materials you have on hand. The proper attitude towards scenario formation involves a type of exploration play that allows natural campaign events and the strategic sensibilities of the players to inform the parameters of play. The traditional understanding of this matter revolves heavily around the concept of game balance. I hope to show that an a priori benchmarking of this sort is not necessary. It is in fact harmful for the wargaming way. The game will be better if the referee and players bring their own ideas of possible adventures to the table and negotiate the terms of engagement with a sense of campaign continuity and realistic strategic goal setting. It works just like real-world strategic planning. Hey, Sapphire Ridge, you did not miss it. Glad you made it. All right, so from that intro, dynamic balancing. One of the most fundamental design choices that D&D has undergone in its historical evolution is resolving the balancing problem by reducing the game into a skirmish combat board game. By treating the game as a series of combat encounters, it is possible to calculate how many enemies of what type provide an appropriate, quote-unquote, challenge for a given adventuring party. The solution is unacceptable for the wargaming way, as the responsibility for the outcome moves from the players to the game system, and simulating a fictional scenario gets replaced with a formally defined board game. The quote-unquote balancing problem is this. As the game is not fun when adventuring is too easy or too hard, how does the referee ensure that the level of challenge is just right? Early D&D largely runs on precedent benchmarking when it addresses the question at all. An appropriate challenge for a first-level party is an encounter with 3d6 goblins, because that's how it's developed to be. An adventure for a fourth-level party is known to be such due to a combination of eyeballing and comparing to prior examples. However, there is a more fundamental approach to the conundrum to be had. Dynamic balancing is an approach that arises from the explorative aspect of wargaming. What if, instead of assuming that the referee is responsible for game balance, we allow the group to discover scenario balancing through the activity of play itself? Okay, I need a quick drink here. The simplest illustration of this principle is allowing the adventuring party to choose which scenario, under which conditions they're willing to tackle. This is the traditional part of extended open world D&D. Adventurers discover opportunities to adventure, research these opportunities, and make choices. This is absolutely different from having the referee choose the scenario, Most fundamentally, in that a referee who has prepared several adventures has no structural motivation to convince the players to engage any particular one. The kind of play that occurs in the between scenarios exploratory space is best understood as scenario negotiation. It may well actually be an explicit negotiation. The play group plainly talks about what kinds of scenarios they would like to play next. If I set up a court intrigue adventure, would you like to play it? But the negotiation may as well be implicit, subsumed into the low stakes exploration of the campaign setting. Besides choosing the scenario, a group allowed to explore the setting and develop stories in between sessions will also be able to engage in a gentle tug of war over the resources the party brings to the scenario they choose. Can we afford the logistics tail to reach this target dungeon? We should haggle for more of an advance from the quest giver. If the ref grants us 10 hirelings, we can tackle this. You can do it, do it, do it. A referee who prepares for players to accept or refuse their scenario material will also be procedurally prepared for adventures to retreat from a scenario underway. This is, again, a massive dynamic balancing factor. Variations include such concepts as partial success and sub-goals, all of which enable a party with dim prospects to dynamically revise their goals in the scenario to accord with the facts on the ground. What was supposed to be a standard dungeon clearing operation may instead become an aliens-esque fighting retreat and a very exciting and successful session of play despite being, quote-unquote, too hard by external measure. Brian Smith says, this is some high IQ writing here. My group ain't this advanced. Well, only one person has to be able to parse this, Brian Smith, and it might be you. It might be you. And if it should so happen that the scenario proves too easy after all the haggling, well, sometimes the players do indeed outmaneuver the game world and the campaign premise, and the referee in a way, and achieve victory on the strategic level. Good for them. And besides, an easy scenario may be escalated when the situation develops, and it can be executed summarily with a faster play procedure, so you can move on from an easy adventure to the follow-up challenges. Which dynamic balancing factors are in play in a campaign depends a lot on the overall campaign structure. But even a basic D&D campaign where maneuvering begins at the dungeon door should, at the very minimum, have the option of retreat. I say this plainly. Without player-controlled retreat, the game is broken. You might as well drop the players, too. Have the GM play on their own, as they are both choosing what's behind the door and forcing you to open it. Well, this is true. I thought he was going to put it in the same spin as the accounting of time. But yes, you need to be able to allow retreats. Absolutely. You can't ever mess up too badly as the referee in choosing what scenarios to present if the campaign is completely serious about letting the players call it off and preserve their beloved character assets should they conclude the scenario doesn't seem feasible to them. The balancing problem can only raise its ugly head if you disempower the players from affecting their own destiny. If the referee does indeed choose what you'll play, how you'll play, and what choices must be done in play, then it is on their head if the dice roll awry and the beloved character dies. You made it too hard. So then naturally the solution to that is to start cheating on the dice to ensure that you only get pleasant outcomes. Allowing dynamic balancing to occur by actually enabling the players to make strategic decisions, even if it is just a decision to retreat, is a fundamental necessity for the real challenge to survive. Sapphire Ridge says that the players choose to drop down an unknown pit in the dungeon, it's their own fault. They got to find a new way back as a consequence. Yes, this is true, though that's not what they're saying. He's just saying that you're not putting the party in a situation in which you're forcing them in a direction and they can't go back from. So yes, the players go down to a pit and they don't secure a way to go back up out of the pit. That's totally on them. But it was their choice to go into the pit, and theoretically, if they could climb out of the pit, you would let them, as opposed to forcing them in a situation where they are in the pit and they can't get out, kind of thing. So we're on to, I had something else to say about this, and now I can't remember. So I think the scenario negotiation thing is interesting. I think it's maybe something that as GMs we could maybe pay attention to a little bit, which is, or maybe I think as GMs to pay attention to the fact that, or that opening for negotiating on the scenario, right? Where you're presenting something to the party and they want to have that back and forth. I think it's good to be open with that. I think the other thing is, as players, something that I don't think I've really thought much about on my own time, but it's that exploration of the scenario, meaning but not the actual, maybe exploration is not right, the research of the scenario. So, for example, if you say, "Oh, there's there's a goblin problem over here in this swamp," I think oftentimes as players we just kind of go, "Oh, that sounds cool," and then we go. Whereas I kind of like the idea, and I think as a GM I'd want to reinforce in my party is maybe you need to do some checking out first, right? Don't just grab your guys and go straight to the swamp. Maybe go to the town that's nearby the swamp, and maybe ask some questions and do some more digging, because from the scenario negotiation part, right? That's that part where you may find if there's something more to the situation, or there's some wrinkle, you may get that. And I think that's a neat thing to I guess try to encourage in the party, that because it's another thing that kind of puts in their hands, like, hey, there was a dragon hidden behind those goblins. Well, you probably could have figured that out if you didn't go right to the goblins, but instead you went to the town and they's like, oh gosh, there's a dragon attack, kind of thing, right? So encouraging your players to ask questions, but they also being open to, as they point out here, the fact is that you might have all that stuff and they go, no, we do not want to deal with a dragon. We do not want to deal with a dragon today, kind of thing. All right, negotiating outside the scenario box. Common misunderstanding of the neutral arbitrator role of the referee is that you must be strict at all times. That's what consistent and fair adjudication means, right? Being strict. However, the actual structure of the game is more complex than that. And while many referees seem to grasp the creative dynamics naturally, sometimes there is a cognitive confusion. Why do I feel like the game cannot possibly function if I keep being objective, simulative all the time? It's because it can't. An extended campaign necessarily has two distinct phases that it switches between as we keep playing. One is the scenario play that we do when everything is set up and the hunt is on. The players maneuver smartly and the ref adjudicates strictly because we are now playing for real. The other phase of play is what happens in between the scenario play, the negotiation phase, so to say. We haven't quite established everything for the scenario to begin yet, and so we are still exploring, still negotiating what the next challenge will be like. The player roles are fairly different in scenario play and in the negotiation phase of the campaign. So being explicitly aware of the shifts can be very useful for improving your play. I think that's kind of what I was just saying. So I agree. As a player, your job during a scenario is to think and maneuver to win the scenario. During the negotiation phase, there is nothing real to win or lose. There are no stakes on the table. This enables the players to maneuver more freely to negotiate the terms of the next challenge with the referee. And similarly, on the referee side, during scenario play, you are strict and fair and play the situation as it falls. You don't fudge probabilities or merely assume that things fall together in a convenient way. But when the game enters the negotiation phase, you as well have vastly greater discretion. The goal is scenario formation, and it cannot possibly happen if you pretend to be an unbiased machine. More machine than man. All right, now we've got some charts. Or I guess 3 charts. The 3 historically common campaign structures used in old school D&D. Consider how negotiated balance can be accomplished in these structures. Feels like a quiz. All right, so the first one's called the basic excursion model. The original mega dungeons were played this way. And so you have GM's dungeon, you have one arrow going to the session, or I guess it's all the sessions. So the sessions are started at the headquarters, and then you go on the excursion, and then you score it, right? Scoring in that sense is pretty much, how much loot you come back with, presuming you come back at all, and then it continues session on session. After that, we have the basic module Pearl String. The Pearl String of basic modules. Adventure modules teach playing this way. You have GM preps the modules, and you have the module which goes on for sessions, and then you have module. So each of the modules is one content block, as it were. And now you have advanced negotiated sandboxing, when the game gets deep. So you have a series going back and forth between scenarios and negotiations. In the negotiation phase, you have prep, downtime, dickering, and doll housing. Not sure what doll housing refers to. And then inside the scenario, you've got your dungeon crawling, hex crawling, maneuvers, and intrigue. So in between there, you've got this negotiation phase. I definitely like the idea of formalizing the negotiation part, which I don't think I'd seen before. Or maybe I'd seen it and don't recall it. An example to illustrate the difference between the phases of play. Hiring mercenaries mid-adventure. If adventurers decide during a scenario that they cannot handle the challenge alone, that they need help, the referee will presumably determine the availability of mercenaries in the local settlements by simulating the situation. There could be help available at prices the adventurers can afford or not. If not, maybe this is a loss then, and the party should give up. Now we have hiring mercenaries in scenario negotiation. When you're considering a new adventure with the group and the players conclude that they need to find help before tackling the scenario, it behooves the referee to suggest that mercenary hirings are available at affordable terms. Not at terms that trivialize the scenario for the referee, but to an extent that makes it possible for play to actually occur. You cannot bend this much, then we must play a different scenario. So basically, if you set your party up, and or you set your scenario up, right? And the party's like, ooh, that seems really tough. I'm not sure we want into it. The bending part is saying, well, hey, you can get hirelings, right? You're not just saying, nope, that's the deal. Nope. Because if you do that, then the party might just go, well, we can't take it on yet. That's cutting our margins too close or whatnot. It's too tight. We don't want to take that risk. So you're being a little bit flexible. And, there's basically, since the idea here that Muster's suggesting is that you're outside when you're in this negotiation phase, you're pulled back a bit from the simulation part of the game. You have more freedom to be kind of flexible like that. Sapphire Ridge says, I'll pop this on screen. Is it suggesting that players negotiate with the referee directly? Yeah, it is. Pretty much it is. And I think they said it on the last page. Either or. I mean, not either or. Yes, they could be negotiating. You could do it explicitly or implicitly in the fiction. But yes, they're saying that basically you're negotiating with the referee. How you want to handle it, if you want to handle it in kind of fiction wise, or you just want to handle it as a straight up players to referee negotiation, either one is, I think, would equally fine right there. But yes, it is basically a straight up negotiation at some point. Perhaps Rich falls up, or or interacting with sages or other NPC faction leaders. That would be doing it through the fiction, right? So if it's about going to sages and faction leaders and all that stuff to evaluate, that would be doing it in the fiction, or you could basically set it up explicitly. It's kind of up to you. I mean, I think my style, I would probably go with in fiction, right? But doing it the other way, doing it by just saying, hey, here's the scenario that I've got going, and this is whatever, I think would work too. So however it works for you. Sorry a minute. Sapphire's Ridge says, no matter what, I'd do it in fiction too. Yeah, I think the thing is that, so my takeaway would be for myself, right, is if I'm at a point where the players aren't getting it or at an impasse fictionally, I would feel free to break that fourth wall, whatever you want to call it, and just talk directly as the referee, right? If they're not getting it or something like, and that's that kind of the same thing, sort of the hiring mercenaries part is the parties hemming and hawing, and you can see that we don't have the resources to do this, whatever, and they're kind of missing the fact. You can say, hey, just so you know, you got mercenaries here that are available, or hirelings, whatever, right? That would be kind of breaking through. It's not necessarily the sage telling you this or the faction leaders. You're the referee saying, hey, remember, you can hire mercenaries. They're out there, whatnot. So yeah, it's whatever gets you to the finish line, sort of thing. Let's see. As you can see, the appropriate stance that everybody takes during the two phases of play is very different. During a scenario, you're concerned with what is possible, what is likely, and what happens. Outside of a scenario, you're more working with what is meaningful, what is fun, and what the group wants to do. Applying the in-scenario thinking to exploration play results in unnecessary meandering, and applying the exploratory mindset to the actual scenario results in biased adjudication that cannot distinguish between good and bad tactics. It's possible and in a certain way sensitive to perceive the two campaign phases as the referee relaxing and tightening his oversight according to the situation. When the important thing is establishing the scenario, you perform challenge coordination. And when the important thing is resolving the scenario, you perform strict adjudication. The experienced referee may sometimes switch between these two phases quite quickly and often as play dips in and out of very challengeful situations. Another way to look at this is that the negotiation phase pits the desires of players for what they want to do, what they want for their characters, against the desires of the GM, how they want to acknowledge the campaign setting, what kind of scenario they want to play. While actual play pits the warcraft of the players against the modeled facts of the scenario. It's not players versus GM in either case, not really, but the former is surely more of a negotiation, while the latter is more of a clash. It may also be useful to visualize the campaign structure in terms of scenario boxes. Play negotiations meandering through the campaign space, finding and building various boxes, all of which correspond to some specific, gameable, interesting challenges that the group receives in the campaign fiction. And then play dips inside one of those boxes. That the referee takes the gloves off, the players put their game faces on, and actual play begins. Play occurs inside the box, and occasionally you come out loosening up the procedures. All right. In a complex organic campaign, the boxes may, of course, overlap and encompass each other. If your character runs a company on the brink of bankruptcy and your only chance is a risky expedition to find an obscure treasure, you're running two boxes, one inside the other. The challenge of the expedition inside the challenge of the business management. Being aware of the boxes helps retain awareness of what your task in the game is moment to moment. Sometimes strict, sometimes cooperative. Oh boy. All right. Well, I think there was a lot to go over there, but yeah, I think ultimately I like the idea of thinking in terms of, okay, we're in this, and I think negotiation is probably a good way to do it. There may be some other ways to describe it. I have to think about it more, but I think I like the concept of negotiation because it means you're kind of giving and taking, right? It's not just a one-way thing where you're, you tend to think with the world oftentimes when you're playing in this scenario, you kind of have physics, whatever you want to call the rules of the world, and those things are more or less non-negotiable, right? If gravity is what it is, maybe you can jump however you roll, whatever, but at some point, like, it's gravity. And if someone goes like, hey, can I break gravity? And the answer is no, you cannot break gravity. That's just a law. Now, when you get into the negotiation part, things kind of loosen up. Your players are talking about, let's say, what kind of adventure they want to undergo next. And maybe you're looking at it and they're talking and you're talking and you're thinking like, well, this town doesn't really have the thing that they want to do, but maybe I can make that thing. I know that they, as players, they're really interested in doing this, whatever that thing is. Maybe I can make that happen for them. Me, as outside of the scenario part where I'm not worried about whatever, I can be a little bit looser with that stuff. It's like, yeah, we can bring somebody to town. They can make that out. Oh yeah, they wanted this. Okay, I can kind of do that. But then once the scenario begins, like, okay, now we're back in the sense, I guess the box is a good analogy for there, because now we're back in the stricter sense where we have more of those things. Whereas I can play a little loosey-goosey and we're just kind of setting things up, right? I can kind of bend, if not break the rules a little bit to kind of maybe make something happen. Not the rules necessarily like physics or whatever necessarily, but like I can take that chess piece. I kind of like, I guess the way I'm thinking about it is sort of like in that, see the movie, the classic movie Clash of the Titans, when Zeus takes the figure, or no, somebody else does. Was it Hera that takes Perseus' figure and moves it on the board, and so he wakes up in a different place. Suddenly he's there. I wouldn't want to do that if I was in a scenario. Doing that would be akin to me of kind of railroading to something else, where I'm like pushing the pieces where I want them to be, as opposed to where that I've decided in the world has decided they're going to be, and suddenly I'm making those decisions for them. I would not want to do that. But if someone says like, gee, I'd like this to happen, I'm like, yeah, I can move this person over here. They kind of like, yeah, we can just say that he was coming into town right after they arrived, something like that, right? I can kind of bend the rules off, outside the sphere a little bit and do that. It's kind of how I'm thinking about it. Does that make sense? Sci-Fi Rich says, negotiation. Can we break gravity there if we found a potion of flight? Well, there you go. So I would probably say a potion of flight doesn't break gravity, but sure. All right, emergent discovery. How are we doing on time? All right, doing all right. I don't know how long is this? Okay, go. I think depending on how long it takes me to read this, maybe we'll end at the next chapter head. Emergent discovery. If play consists of two phases, the negotiation phase and the scenario play, and the negotiation phase is supposed to be this touchy-feely, quote-unquote, everybody gets what they want thing, then does that mean that we don't need to use rules and game state tracking in between scenarios? After all, what we're trying to do is to set up the next scenario. What does it matter how much money the adventurers have? or how much political favor, or where they get that ship. They can't get a ship, then they can't sail the adventure island, and then we don't have a game. So why bother worrying about where the ship comes from? This observation is entirely true to an extent. Basic D&D specifically will actually benefit overall from the players having a clear sense of what quote-unquote matters in this sense, and what does not need to. You're playing a scenario when you're in the dungeon, and while there, it matters a hell of a lot how much of anything, even breathable air, you have. But when you return to the base town from the dungeon, what does actually matter at that point? Living adventures will recuperate in time, and then you can go back into the dungeon. The wealth you bring out matters for XP scoring, but it doesn't really do anything in a strategic sense. You're still going back into the dungeon, and you're doing it with roughly the strategic positioning that you'd be doing anyway. You're not going to make meaningful changes by strategic maneuver. That's what it means for the game to be basic in structure. To be explicit, this is actually how you're supposed to set up adventures in basic campaigns that do not include playable strategic operations. The referee offers the party an adventure at the adventure island, and then outright decides that for the scenario set of convenience, an NPC decides to ship the adventurers to the location. It's a cutscene to get to the scenario started. Don't worry about it. And likewise, when adventurers bring wealth back from the dungeon, the game has a culture of mealy-mouthed step dancing around the question of whether that money matters. Can my character purchase a healing potion with this money or not? Can he buy 100, a +1 magic weapon? The basic game's answer should really be no. Money doesn't really matter. Everybody starts a new dungeon at roughly the same position, no matter if they throw away their money or spend it wisely. You don't actually get to maneuver in between dungeons. That's also the classic kind of Conan-ish thing, right? No matter how much money he's got with him at the end of one adventure, and the next adventure somehow he's drunk it all away, or gambled it, or whatever's gone. Like the money's gone, right? He's seemingly always in kind of a desperate situation, unless you're in a scenario which is where he's a commander of an army or whatever, right? But he always pretty much ends up where he needs to be for the scenario, and how much whatever he did in a previous story has no relevance, because he could start one adventure that, yeah, he's the captain of an army. Next adventure, he's on the run again, or avoiding arrest, or doing something else, right? But of course, that's not how things always go in D&D. The character gets rich in the dungeon, and the players calculate how much an entire inn costs just for the hell of it. Find out that this guy has enough money to buy his own inn. Dream occupation, so they'll actually retire from adventuring to run an inn instead. It's all between adventures funny play, not a serious challenge. Just a bit of fun before the player creates a new adventure to go on the next trip. But it did remove a character from play. That's a real consequence. The point is that things can happen in the negotiation phase, important things in the sense that they inspire the group's campaign direction. A circus comes to town. It's just a throwaway comment by anybody, and in addition to the tapestry of narration. Yet somehow the referee gets inspired to run a circus of crime adventure, seizing on the detail and pitting the adventures against evil clowns. All right, who does not love evil clowns? Goodness knows I do. What started as low-stakes, loose ideation emerges into a serious scenario. Well, serious with a question mark in parentheses. That's why established, powerful campaigns tend to run a fairly sticky world simulation, even between actual scenarios, tracking the calendar, party finances, wider geography, and all kinds of other things that are not directly scenario pertaining makes for a lush undergrowth of inspiration in actually negotiating the next scenario. How else would you ever end up wandering a dungeon naked and drunk, if not because the downtime events after the last adventure strongly suggested something along those lines? Allowing the strategic campaign state to inspire the adventure planning is the path of inspiration. Sapphire Ridge says carousing thingy. Yep, very much carousing thingy. All right, so we've got a section. Well, let me see. Let me check. I think maybe I can go over to do this next bit. Right? Can I? Methinks I can. Let me see how long this is. Sapphire Ridge says, does this mesh with domain level play? I mean, it does in the fact that this is kind of an explanation sort of a philosophical underpinning of why you might want to have domain play, because again, domain play rich, what do they call it? A lush undergrowth of inspiration. But as I mentioned when I talked to Justin Alexander the other day, right, we talked about domain play a little bit, that it can be challenging to run when the game doesn't really support it. Like, it's difficult when it's kind of a bolted add-on as opposed to something that's integrated. And I haven't read it, so I probably should. He mentions Blade in the Dark having a good loop that really includes kind of domain, or if domain development as part of Jump, as you start, I guess, as someone who is creating a crew or runs a crew, and so you're doing things that consistently you're growing the crew. So it's kind of you're building your domain as you go. So it's organic to everything you're doing. That we kind of have that on the one hand, and I think Birthright is trying to do that same thing. And then the other hand, you have kind of more classic D&D where they just kind of like, oh yeah, at name level or whatever level, oh, you can build a castle and kind of do that thing, which made a lot more sense to them back in the day because it was essentially just plugged right back into the literal. I remember talking about playing D&D like a war game. That plugs right back into the literal wargaming part where it's like, great, now I've got this citadel, and that ties into our grand wargaming campaign. We take away the grand wargaming campaign bits, the domain stuff is kind of a hanging chad unless you really build up support for it. Does that make sense? Maybe. All right, let me see how long this Necromancer section is. Let's see, 156. 12 pages or 11 pages. All right, let's do it. It's Friday. I'm feeling spicy. This is the Necromancer. Our original historical fantasy campaign started in 2011 and kept up for 100 sessions, weirdly, for various real-life concerns shook the group up. One of the more memorable adventures during that time was the saga of Voldemort the Necromancer. Wonder where they got that from. Starting around session 66 and continuing for a dozen sessions or so. I thought back then, and still do, that it was a fairly good example of what organic sandbox campaign developments actually look like. Instead of a series of adventure modules tackled one at a time, it's more like a complicated weave of emergent concerns. I'll sketch a quick picture of how the events of the Voldemort saga arose and concluded. This was all cleanly executed in the wargaming way, so even if the events may at times seem dramatized, they were arrived at via situation modeling and dynamic play choices. The only plans involved were campaign seeding, adventure maneuvers, and up-force countermeasures. Aaron says, ye who must be renamed. Yeah, something like that, for sure. Obviously, a lot of detail goes into just one session of play, so this is necessarily mostly going to focus on the structural big picture instead of the moment-to-moment maneuvers. All right, so we're picking up here section 66, or session, I should say, 66. The adventuring party was at loose ends after their last adventure. Chaplain Rolf, first-level cleric, striving to make good with the local bishopric, heard disconcerting rumors of necromantic worship in a remote village. It was Insidious, a fairly straightforward, low-tier adventure module I was introducing. The first session was mainly consumed by preliminary maneuvers in traveling to the locality, interviewing commoners, and discovering the abandoned manor of the last burgomeister. There was an encounter with Sturgis. Session 67. A couple of core players visited me a few times over the week to prep the actual session with some low-stakes scouting and mapping actions in the less interesting parts of the manor. The party started the actual session well-positioned for immediate action. The party at this time had a third-level fighting man, second-level ranger type, and a fourth-level cleric in addition to the first-level guys. So no big deal clearing out the orcs for the most part. Encountering the 10th level necromancer hiding out underneath the manor house came as a sudden and rude surprise. I can imagine. The party fighter was charmed initially, which was just the start of the difficulties. The second assault on the necromancer's lair almost resulted in a total party kill, and would have if not for the combat cleric Juanita and his enchanted strength. The party had brought in a third-level elf paladin to replace the charmed fighter. Varaniel, the elf, fell from paladinhood that night. Oh, geez. Failing to stop Juanita from bashing the necromancer to death with his bare hands. Ouch. So, hold on here, just to put this. So, the Juanita had enchanted strength, and then the elf fell from paladinhood by failing to stop Juanita from bashing the necromancer to death with his bare hands. I wonder why that makes a fall. I guess because they meant was it done unsporting wise? I'm curious how that caused a fall from paladinhood, but that's in the details, which we unfortunately don't get with this particular recap. Afterwards, the party discovered the Necromancer's spellbook, a great treasure for an emerging mid-tier party seeking after the mysteries of the occult. We found that the Necromancer's name was Voldemort. Significantly, this was the first time the campaign rules produced a relic from the death of a leveled character. Voldemort dropped a skull pendant that elf Vareniel took for his own after the murder. So I guess they seem to suggesting that maybe they snuck in and killed the Necromancer in their sleep, which would be kind of a dishonorable way to do things as opposed to fighting, honorable combat. Session 68, we did a midweek solo session with Timo, the player of Varaniel the Elf, establishing that Varaniel was indeed using the reliquary pendant left behind by the Necromancer in his spell research. Varaniel was not always an elf. He underwent soul transmigration to escape a cursed disease earlier. So while possessing the Aladrin might, he hardly knew how to wield his magical potential. I had rolled for the nature of Voldemort's relic, and of course, fate favored it being a phylactery, or a Horcrux, as the kids call it. Oh, Timo was well read on Harry Potter, so yeah, we were on the same page here. We modeled the influence that the Necromancer's Horcrux would wield over Varaniel's actions over between adventures' downtime, establishing that he was soon inspired to escape into the night with his mysterious new manservant Gregor. The guy just popped up uninvited a few weeks after the Necromancer's death. Completely normal development. The Were-Rat. Varaniel himself was convinced that he was questing to find a shortcut to magical power. We, the players, knew that he was being subtly influenced by the pendant and by Gregor's advice. Varaniel was soon busy hiring guides and traveling into the wilderness, seeking nothing less than the dread nameless cult site of Deathfrost Doom. That sounds like a wonderful place to vacation. Session 69, a slow beat session following the party's continuing attempts to finding and solving small fry adventures. Neither Timo, Varaniel's player, nor Pietza, apologies for any horrible name mangling on my part, Juanita's player, were with us, and the campaign's Spearpoint adventurer Hans Kruger wasn't yet ready to begin his Italian campaign, so something small was indicated. The party ultimately ended up following an old lead. For some reason, they thought that an outlaw's band's planning sheets would still be current information 15 sessions later, and stumbling upon some natural caverns by accident. The most noteworthy part of the session was when one of the adventurers got court-martialed and sentenced to death for perfidious cowardice by the rest of the party. Jeez, tough party. Session 70, another solo session with Varaniel in between the regular meetings. Varaniel and his trusty retainer Gregor were quite self-satisfied at finding, quote-unquote, the ancient Duvan Ku shrine they were looking for in the mountains. Gregor obviously serves Voldemort the Necromancer, and unknown to Varaniel is working toward said worthy's imminent resurrection. Timo was missing again, scheduling partial inspiration for those solo sessions in the first place, but we had the rest of the core crew. I had sketched out a really dumb one-page dungeon about time travel and cavemen discovering fire. Sounds nifty. So with players amenable to a complete change of pace, we did that for one session. The wiser players didn't send their best characters, and indeed, none of the 4 Braves sent into the past returned. Aww. At the end of the session, Juanita, a core character in the party's attempts at base building, finally discovered that Varaniel the Elf was missing. Him going on a mysterious private journey wasn't that strange, but when Juanita found Voldemort's spellbook missing as well, he certainly managed to connect the dots. On to session 72, a third solo session for Varaniel the Elf. Varaniel descended into the maw of the nameless cult site. He was very brave, perhaps confused, and immeasurably confident that his magical career was in high bloom. Gregor the henchman was encouraging, but betrayed no overt knowledge of this vile place. Varaniel followed the susurrus unerringly, and, as it happened, the preserved head of Voldemort, alongside his grimoire and the Horcrux amulet, enabled the pair to pass into the Holy of Holies of the temple. Timo totally expected Gregor to betray him at a key moment, and he wasn't expected to play stupid in any way, but the timing of the assault surprised him, and the magical curse of the High Altar caught Varaniel unawares. Gregor the Were-Rat knew that one of the two would have to die for Voldemort to live again, and he didn't intend to be it. Varaniel's one huge flaw as an adventurer and hero has, since suffering a divine curse for temple robbing in session number 8, been his atrocious physical stats. He was hardly able to resist the Were-Rat and prevent himself from being sacrificed upon the foul altar. Oof. Tough run for Varaniel. Session 73. The party had discovered Varaniel's betrayal or possible bewitchment. The jury was out on that one. The same jury that had sentenced Vengeance number whatever, one of their own, to death a few sessions ago at the end of the last session. The adventurers were in high dudgeon, the players excited at the sudden thrust of player versus player maneuvers. Timo rolled a new character to join in the hunt, not wanting to bring his still charmed fighter. The players were in the dark about what had happened, and I and Timo obviously didn't reveal anything. The session evolved into a tense chase as the party traveled from fantasy Bavaria to fantasy Holland, or Bavaria, I should say, looking for the fortunately fairly recognizable Eladrin form of Varaniels. Various clues left in the wake of his earlier passing helped the party figure out their way to Death Frost Doom. The party traveled up the mountain, explored the surface features, and had the common sense to find out that a duo reminiscent of their description had descended the mountain just 2 days ago. Players made the very smart decision of not messing with Death Frost Doom anymore at this point, and instead chose to continue pursuing Varaniel and that dangerous, blasphemous grimoire. The chase, in quick action, continued across fancy Holland, climaxing finally in Amsterdam, where the party located Varaniel cum Voldemort, double V's, just a day before his ship would depart the harbor for faraway lands. Unfortunately, 3 of the 5 adventurers got distracted in Amsterdam. They basically started their own carnival for some reason. How does that always happen? Which meant that Juanita and Yoriel, Ranger 3, third level Ranger that is, ended up cornering the born-again Necromancer on their own under strength. Now on to the momentous finale. The rest of session 73 took something like 15 minutes of fictional time, consisting of minute-long combat rounds. The fight was a 10th level AD&D wizard and a 3 hit die were-rat against a slowly, densely developed 4th level clerical saint and a 3rd level ranger companion. Unfortunately, Yoriel, I think that's a typo there, left his 4 fighting dogs outside the inn as the players attempted a stealthy assault. They were uncertain still as to what exactly had happened with Varaniel. They hoped to reason things out. Voldemort had full control of Varaniel's body, and Gregor the Were-Rat obviated the surprise by slipping out of the common room and hastening to warn his master of the approaching adventurers. Voldemort, of course, hated Juanita, his murderer, with the fury of a truly evil villain. His last death in the hands of the brutal, quote-unquote, better dead than evil saint was slow and agonizing. The Necromancer opened with a stinking cloud spell, confirming for the players that Varaniel had Voldemort's repertoire and intended to kill. Juanita made the faithful decision to dash through the cloud instead of retreating, seeking a quick and decisive takedown. Seeking the Schwerpunkt of the conflict, so iconically like Piazza. Yoriel couldn't help but back Juanita up, while Gregor the Were-Rat feigned death inside the room to seize surprise later. The local culture of play is not at all steeped in standard D&D lore, and even mid-tier spells are rare. The stinking cloud is far more dangerous than the players realized, and almost finished the fight right there. Juanita managed to rush towards the Necromancer through the cloud, blinded by the burning gas, but stumbled on furniture and allowed the Necromancer to cast his shocking grasp. However, as mentioned above, Juanita was game mechanically dense. In that particular way, only slowly developed characters are. He had a second heart and +1 hit die from uniting with his own doppelganger back in session number 4 of the campaign. The unnatural constitution allowed him to overcome the cardiac arrest. I would love to see some of these things. A second heart, uniting with a doppelganger, some good stuff. This was the first time the Baroque combat rules that our campaign homebrew had developed were really, truly put through their paces in full desperation. Juanita soaked a second shocking grasp, redlining lethally, but kept going with lucky saves, intent on breaking the Necromancer with his own 2 hands, like he did before. Juanita's main saintly boon was his hideous strength, so it was obviously that or nothing when it came to breaking an abomination of a wizard in twain. During the 3rd round of combat, Were-Rat Gregor surprised Yoriel Ranger from behind and then threw himself on the utterly exhausted Juanita when he saw his master being broken by bare hand. Gregor managed the unthinkable and got through Juanita's holy rage, ripping the saint's throat before Yoriel put him down. The fight itself took just 5 minutes of fictional time, but the death opera at the end extended for something like 8 combat rounds as Juanita lay there dying of his wounds. Players didn't know for sure who was alive or dead or who would recover first. It was the first time we had truly developed long-term character dying on us, so the focus was entirely on Juanita. We tried all the strange strings we possibly could, extending his life with various constitution and willpower draws, first aid, magics, and prayers. The Son of God appeared for Juanita in a vision, but unfortunately had no divine miracle for him. It was time for him to go, after vanquishing the great evil, if perhaps not the one he had imagined to be his destiny. Juanita had been gearing up to tackle an evil paganic demigod plaguing the region, the Dullahan. Quote, "You have done more than could be asked of any single mortal man. Be ready to perish and rise up where the angels dwell," unquote, according to my notes. So, of course, Juanita denied salvation in the faint hopes of surviving his last save against system shock from blood loss. He'd rather take a bonus to the save than an invitation to heaven. Adventurers, eh? Uriel failed to save the life of his friend, who with his torn-out throat was unable to swallow healing elixirs. The Amsterdam Peace Patrols arrived soon after, confiscating everything and holding Uriel in custody for 4 months before letting him go. The players were the most pissed at the Republic confiscating Varenial/Voldemort's personal effects, not to speak of the Church claiming Juanita's remains and gear. The poor hero had broken his cloister rule and escaped the direct orders of his bishop the preceding summer, so he was considered legally to be a ward of the Church. This would later result in an amusing follow-on adventure as the adventurers started suspecting Juanita's corpse, entombed in a catacomb, of birthing his still-living doppelganger upon the world. Plus, all his magical gear just sitting up in some dusty tomb. Come on. The party would never finish Juanita's vision of setting up a meaningful center of magical scholasticism, for adventuring benefits, of course, in a stable headquarters for the rising party. The party would never free fantasy Bavaria from the antiquated terrors of the Dullahan. That adventure was, of course, important to us in how it broke the strategic thrust of the adventuring party and lost us 2 mid-tier PCs. The main reason I tell this story, though, is that I think it is a fairly good example of the way individual adventure modules and emergent developments get woven together by the referee, creating a complex strategic field upon which the adventurers maneuver. The outlined 8 sessions involved 4 different adventure modules, whirling in and out of focus, with ultimately most decisive action having almost nothing to do with any single one of them. Notably, the campaign survived emotionally from these losses. Both Timo and Piazza went on to play other characters, and we didn't shy away from similar high-stakes scenarios later on. At least this group back then could play D&D with very high stakes and not completely fall apart at a major setback. Whew, Sapphire Ridge says, this is some brutal down-in-the-mud brawling high fantasy. Absolutely. Now, I know that there's some house rules and stuff that you can, I think they're out there for this campaign, and I think he shared them with some folks. Might be able to get them. I'd love to look at them at some point later on. We're going to stop here, and then next time, we shall pick up next time at Refereeing Fundamentals. That should be a hoot. I don't think I have any last thoughts. That's a great... I mean, I think these are all the things I remember. And I always think to myself, sometimes the most memorable stuff isn't the great victory where you deposed Sauron and deposited the rings and the volcanoes and did all that stuff, but the stuff that's built over hubris and some luck, and some of it good, some of it bad, some weird stuff. And those are the things I think that tend to stick out. And often, I think they would admit it too. I don't think you could have scripted it if you tried to script it as a narrative. You probably couldn't, and it wouldn't have been as good. This was an awesome little adventure, and I think the fact that it was Emergent, not only is it, well, it's Emergent, so that's clever, but I think it's the emergence, I think, is what gave the space and energy for this to happen. Kind of thing. Dungeon Master Masterclass says, Muster is some of the highest quality analysis of how an RPG works. I don't agree with everything, but man, the theories are well thought out. Yep, that's a good way to end it. Absolutely. I agree. So, yeah, so we got a lot of meat to chew on until next time. I got a lot of stuff to do. I want to try to get Muster done by the end of the year, so that would be by the end of the month. We'll see. But I got a bunch of stuff, bunches of stuff. But for now, I will bid you adieu. Enjoy the rest of your day, night, whenever you end up watching or listening to this. Game on, everybody, and I will talk to you later. Bye now.